I remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder, treason and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot.
Hi everyone, it's Halloween Dan. Sorry for the dramatic intro. Basically today's chat, random as it is, kind of carries on from the other two chats we've already had, linking into them at least. It leads on to what that intro is if you don't understand the meaning behind that little poem. Remember the 5th of November. You will in a minute. What I'm about to talk about is why England doesn't celebrate Halloween, or at least is only just beginning to re-celebrate Halloween. In the last two episodes and in other discussions we've already had, other videos, I've mentioned several times that in the UK, particularly in England, Halloween is not a big deal. It's not a thing that's widely celebrated. It's gained some ground in maybe the last 30 years, but it's still a very small celebration for most people. And it's still seen as a very American thing, and to a degree they're not wrong. But like I discussed in the last two videos, Halloween has very strong roots in England and the UK. And for a long time, even when the church kind of said that's something you shouldn't be doing, people still did it. People still celebrated on All Hallows Eve, as it was then known, which was also the old-fashioned celebration of Samhain. So if people were so desperate to celebrate it throughout the early medieval period, and it was so necessary a thing to keep doing, why did it die out? Why did it disappear, particularly in England? And that's what the focus of this discussion is going to be about. To really get a grasp of why it disappeared in England particularly, we have to go all the way back to the reign of probably one of our most famous kings, probably famous for the wrong reasons, and that's Henry VIII. So most people out there will have heard the name Henry VIII. They'll be aware of who Henry VIII was. This guy who divorced a lot of people, murdered a lot of people, married a lot of different people, and didn't have a lot to show for it by the end of his reign. But one of the biggest things that happened during the reign of Henry VIII, and it happened almost as a secondary factor, was the dissolving of the relationship between England and the Catholic Church. Up until the reign of Henry VIII, England had been, just like every other nation in Europe, a devout Catholic nation. And when Henry came along, he was a Catholic king. He married a Catholic wife. Catherine of Aragon was famously very Catholic, and their first daughter, Mary, was baptised Catholic. Henry famously wanted to marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn, and wanted a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. A divorce that the Pope would not grant. He wanted him to stay with Catherine of Aragon. So Henry did what any crazy chauvinistic git would do, and he basically said, well, up yours, Pope, and divorced England from the Catholic faith. And he created the Church of England. And in doing so, in divorcing England from the Catholic faith, he created centuries of upheaval across the British Isles. So he divorced his wife, he married Anne Boleyn. That didn't end particularly well. He got a daughter out of it though. But what ended up happening was, to sort of give this new Church of England some legitimacy, was that at some point this new version of Christianity that had begun in Europe actually, of Protestantism, was adopted by England to sort of give it this sort of slightly more legitimate thread. And Protestantism, if you don't know what Protestantism is, it's very boring, literally. Protestantism is probably best described. I'm not a religious, I'm not well up on my religion. But what the basics of it is that Protestantism is like a stripped back version of Catholicism. It's still praying to the same God, Jesus, and all the rest of it. It's just very, very plain. And as Henry VIII went into Queen Elizabeth I, and she was Protestant, and then eventually that led to the first Scottish King of England and Scotland, King James I, or King James VI if you're Scottish, Protestantism became more and more firmly cemented in place. And as that happened, there was a rejection of all Catholic celebrations. Anything that had an even remotely Catholic edge to it was immediately ditched. So what ends up happening throughout this period is that the Catholic celebrations, Catholic holidays, are dropped by England. And this includes the hallowed days or the saints' days on the 1st and 2nd of November. So as they are removed as official days of celebration because they're very Catholic, All Hallows Eve on the 31st of October, which never really was part of that celebration but had always been so closely linked with it, lost its meaning for the second time. So it sort of just sat there on the 31st of October. And for probably quite a long time still, people would still do what they'd always done on the 31st of October. They would celebrate with harvest foods like bonfires, meet up with family, and all that kind of stuff. It was beginning to become harder and harder to do because it now had this Catholic link. Even though it had never been a proper Catholic celebration, it had been linked very strongly with a Catholic celebration. And with it no longer being the eve of any hallowed days, its meaning had been lost. And it was kind of now being perceived, if you celebrated it, then maybe you were still Catholic. And this is, of course, that's not a bad thing now, but back then, it was less of a thing to do with the religion you followed and more of a thing to do with your patriotism and whose side you were on. Did you stand with the king or did you stand with the Pope? And that was a big deal. And all this kind of comes to a head during the reign of King James I. And by that point in time, this is the early 1600s, England is very Protestant, but there is still lots of Catholic conclaves here and there. And lots of Catholics in hiding and pretending they aren't Catholic, even though the state officially knows that they are. And to be openly Catholic was a serious, serious problem. If you were caught practicing in a Catholic way, being Catholic priest, as an example, you would be executed or severely punished at least. It was a dark time to be a Catholic in England. So this was a time of incredible persecution. The Catholics were under terrible persecution at the hands of the Protestants and the Protestant elite, which was the king and his government and, of course, the Protestant church. So at some point in the early 1600s, a plot is devised by this group of Catholics who decide that this has to change. Things have to change, and there's only one way to change it. It's them or us. And to stop them from being persecuted any longer, they have to remove the Protestant hierarchy. They have to remove the king, they have to remove his government, and they have to remove the Protestant faith. And there's only one way to do that, and that's to kill them all. Unfortunately, that's an easier said than done kind of a situation. But there's one day a year in the British calendar that still takes place today when a lot of these people are together, at least the king and his government are together. And that is on the opening of Parliament that takes place every single year. In 1605, there was a change. I think at the time it was either plague was infesting London or there was something terrible happening in London that stopped them from having the opening of Parliament when it should happen. And the opening of Parliament was reset. I think it was reset twice, but eventually it was reset for the 5th of November. It was quite late. So these plotters decided that this was the time to do something radical. So what they decided to do was basically blow up the Houses of Parliament, the Palace of Westminster, where all these people would be gathered. The king would be there, his parliament would be there. There probably would be some head of the church members there too. So in one bold move of blowing up this one building, they would probably take out most, if not all, of the Protestant hierarchy in one hit. So back then, you could actually hire out chambers, basement chambers, beneath the Palace of Westminster to store goods. It was a common practice. So this group basically hired a chamber somewhere close to the Palace of Westminster. I think they dug a tunnel to get a little further underneath the main chamber of the Palace of Westminster. But that's what they did, and they put loads and loads of gunpowder in this chamber. And the plan was, on the opening of Parliament, on the 5th of November, they would light the fuse, blow the Houses of Parliament up and kill them all. But, unfortunately for them, the plot was discovered. The Houses of Parliament were never blown up. The king and his peers were never destroyed and killed. And the 5th of November then became a remembrance of this failed terrorist plot. So the terrorists were all sort of gathered up and tortured and executed. And the guy that became the focal point of all of this, he wasn't even the main conspirator. I think he was the guy found holding the fuse. But the guy who basically ends up being the one who's remembered the most is called Guy Fawkes, Guy Fawkes. And his name now is synonymous with this event, the gunpowder treason and plot. And after this point, there's a shift. Something takes place. There's a shift in England in many, many ways. And you've got to sort of see this from the point of view, particularly of the king and the church. They've been battling with Catholicism within England for decades now. And, of course, the Catholics in continental Europe want to see England Catholic again, and have tried to get it Catholic again several times and failed. But this was the final straw now. Now the Protestant church and the Protestant king had proof that God was on their side. That if God was Catholic, if God really wanted England to be Catholic again, then surely he'd have allowed this plot to succeed. He would have allowed the Westminster to have been blown up and to have taken out all of the king and all of his government. But that didn't happen. So in their minds, in the church's minds and in the king's mind, that means that their faith, the Protestant faith, is the right one. They have been vindicated. So from that moment on, the shift that happens is that this is no longer just about, what faith you choose to follow. If you choose to follow Catholicism in England, you're wrong, because God says you're wrong. But also, you're also a traitor. If you choose to be a Catholic, then you must be on the side of them conspirators, those plotters that wanted to kill the king. You're a traitor to the crown and to your country. And then that's when the real change happens in England. That's when things will never be the same. So what has that got to do with Halloween? Two things, really. And I suppose the second one happens almost by accident. So the 5th of November is, of course, very close to the 31st of October. The church and the king, the whole political spectrum, wanted people to remember this event. They wanted people to remember that on this date of the 5th of November, this terrorist plot had failed. And it was very important that people remember it. That's what that rhyme's about. Remember, the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. They wanted people to remember this event forever. They wanted to put their stamp on this date and say, this was when Protestantism in England defeated Catholicism. So, and the way they wanted people to remember it was by lighting bonfires. They wanted people, this was a time of year when people lit bonfires anyway. the end of the harvest and all that sort of stuff. So they wanted people to light bonfires, and people did. I think probably for the first few years, people did naturally anyway, because they would burn effigies of the Catholic conspirators on top of the bonfire. Sounds gruesome, but it's true. But the church wanted to make this an annual thing forever. Everybody should remember this date forever and ever and ever. And it worked. 400 years later, we still celebrate Bonfire Night. We still light bonfires. We still burn effigies of Guy Fawkes on top of the bonfire. And although the emphasis on the story of this defeated Catholic plot is sort of brushed under the carpet a little bit, and now it's more like a family-friendly event where we let off some nice fireworks, the reason we're celebrating on the 5th of November still harks back to this time and this event and that reasoning. Again, what's that got to do with Halloween? Well, two things. Number one, people would traditionally light bonfires on the 31st of October as part of their harvest festivals. And the church now said, well, you know, who wants to light 2 bonfires in a singular week? Save your timber, save your wood, make a much larger bonfire for the 5th. Don't burn your bonfires on the 31st of October. But also, if you were to burn your bonfire on the 31st of October, instead of on the 5th, what did that say about you? What did that say to your neighbours? Were you a Catholic? Were you in on it? Were you a conspirator? Would you have preferred to have seen the king dead? Were you a traitor? You could imagine these thoughts in people at that time. So people genuinely were like, well, I'm not going to set my bonfire off on the 31st anymore. We'll save our harvest festival till the 5th. We'll do it then. It's only 5 days later. We can wait that long. And so that's what happened. So it kind of like a double stroke. The Protestant church not only managed to cement their place in England forever, but they also managed to get rid of All Hallows Eve, something even the Catholic Church had been unable to do for centuries. Even though getting rid of All Hallows Eve and Halloween as a thing in England wasn't the main reason for this, for making people celebrate on the 5th of November, that ended up being the case. And that's why for 400 years, Halloween in England, or All Hallows Eve, just stopped being a thing. People just stopped celebrating it because they had this other event on the 5th of November. Why would they celebrate these two things? Save your timber, save your firewood, and burn an effigy on the 5th of November. You know, because that's not dark at all, is it? So then this next question rolls out of that one. If that's the case, why did America pick up All Hallows Eve? Where did that come from? And why has it now sort of reinstated itself? Well, America, the US, is massively influenced by immigrants. And many of those immigrants came from places like Ireland and Scotland, where All Hallows Eve continued to be celebrated, particularly in a more Celtic way, in the form of Samhain. And Ireland retained it because most of Ireland remained Catholic. And as such, Irish immigrants moved over to the Americas. They took with them Samhain. They took with them this night of mischief. And many of the things that the Irish did, the trick or treat element of sort of removing gates of people who didn't have treats waiting for them and all that kind of, the mischief night sort of element of it, was brought from Ireland. It wasn't actually until the early 1900s that, I can't remember her name, but some American woman basically said it needs to be less about mischief and causing destruction and more about like a party, a bit of fun where we can wear costumes and we can play games and all that kind of stuff. And that's around the time when we start to call it Halloween. It's no longer Samhain, it's no longer All Hallows Eve, it's started to become Halloween, which is a sort of grouping of that name. Hallow from the All Hallows Eve and the Een from Samhain or Samhain or however you want to pronounce it. And so over the 20th century, America reimagines Halloween again and again and again and develops it again and again and again until eventually, by maybe the sort of 70s or 80s, Halloween starts to get picked up again in England. So it's a cyclical thing. We had it, we stopped having it, America ran with it, and now it's back in the UK. And Halloween is an American thing. There's no getting away from that. But its roots are definitely in England and the rest of the UK as a whole, and Ireland and so on and so forth. So it's kind of done a full circle. And the fact that I'm now celebrating it as openly as I do is just testament to the fact that for thousands of years, people have felt the drive to celebrate at that time of year. And the weird part is, even though Bonfire Night in the UK is now dominant on the 5th of November, I would say probably in the last 20 years, there's more negativity towards Bonfire Night in England than there is about Halloween. For a long time, the negativity around Halloween was all to do with trick-or-treating and people begging, and it's an American thing, and then there's the sadist element, which is ridiculous, that we've already spoken about. And Bonfire Night was seen as this fun, innocent thing that people had done for generations. But now, weirdly, it's kind of seen the other way around. It's seen as this, should we in the modern times be celebrating this thing that was so obviously an anti-Catholic thing? Even the firework thing. People get annoyed by fireworks nowadays. They're too loud, they're annoying, they frighten animals and wildlife and dogs and cats and things. So there's a lot more negativity around Bonfire Night now than probably there is around Halloween. And so every year, more and more people celebrate Halloween in the UK, and less people celebrate Bonfire Night. And weirdly, Halloween seems to be more and more the focus of people's attention. So things have kind of gone back for 100 years in a strange kind of a way, and it's something that I am incredibly happy about. This is the end of my rambling videos. I'll soon get into the whole, we're going into the Halloween season. I know it's only March. It'll soon be April and Easter, but my brain is already whirling away with ideas of things that I can do, things that I can make better, possibly some new props, Yeah, so that's something to look forward to. Hope these videos haven't been too boring for you. I hope maybe you've learned something. Hope you've enjoyed them on some level. If you have, please give us a like. Please share the video. Please comment in the video. I'd love to hear some comments about what you think about what I've said. So anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all soon. Bye.